The Persephone Foundation. Timeline Archives. Timeline designation 2016-004. Madam Supreme Leader. This is another timeline where there is a second American Civil War, this time stemming from a Hillary victory and a Texit that later grows across the country. Russia and China back the rebels. Canada, Mexico, and the EU, sans the UK, back the federal government. Things get really bad when the rebels manage to win a string of victories, including seizing several nuclear missile silos. It's not really known who launched first, but by 2018, both sides have nuked each other. Both sides have nuked each other. Not to oblivion, most of the arsenal was not launched, but enough to cripple both sides. Both sides agree to a ceasefire before more nukes are launched, under extreme pressure from the outside world. A border is set along the ceasefire line, which eventually becomes known as the American Demilitarized Zone. The United States is reformed as the Democratic Republic of North America by Clinton, who reshapes her image as that of a revolutionary who will rebuild the destroyed America in a new image. America will be great because it is good, and no evil will be tolerated. With most political opponents already dead or on the other side of the DMZ, and the country in shambles, Clinton has a year zero opportunity. Whether it is her psyche cracking from the war, psychological issues stemming from her stroke, an underlying sociopathy that was always there, or the influence of fanatics beneath her ranks, Clinton becomes an absolute tyrant. Her kind visage stares down from portraits on the public squares and living rooms of the new America. Plays and films, such as the 3-hour epic Rodham, is required viewing, and shows the great helmswoman in top form. The Americans of the DRNA are taught that they are the perfect beings, far more enlightened than the rest of the impure world, the world which was and remains hostile, particularly the Russians and Chinese, who mercilessly slaughtered Americans during the war. Women, naturally, are elevated over men. While men are important as soldiers and manual laborers, everybody knows that their inherent violence and stupidity makes them incapable of leadership. Hence, the DRNA is run almost exclusively by women, with only a few military leaders being the exception. The vision of progress with Madam President shall go unopposed. Anybody who thinks otherwise quickly disappears into the many gulags dotting the country, all the while the American people starved. The ruined environment and limited shipments of the outside world meant that anybody apart from the elite were given terrible rations. The government had total control of every aspect of life. A war measure that never went away because the war technically is not over. Even growing crops is illegal, ostensibly to stop people from eating or distributing food grown in irradiated soil. Perhaps the funniest thing about it all is that while Hillary Clinton is still president, she's been dead for decades. Clinton died in 2038, 20 years after the end of the Second American Civil War. Her daughter, Chelsea, runs the country as the vice president, but not even she can take the role of Madam President. The rest of the world isn't doing too well either. The Second American Republic was, for a long time, the personal fiefdom of President Trump, who in turn was replaced with a string of military leaders and puppet presidents, before democracy was restored only a decade ago. However, the Second American Republic has become wealthy, although not as powerful as the old United States, and dependent on Russian and Chinese troops. Russia and China also underwent transformations. Putin succeeded in rebuilding the USSR to a certain degree, although the new Eurasia is closer to a new Russian empire. Eurasia has democratized over the years, and its political system at the national level even resembles that of the old USA. The CCP was taken down from within by a Xi Jinping who narrowly avoided a coup against him by CCP hardliners he targeted for the next wave of anti-corruption measures. Iran's theocratic government fell in the 2020s and modernized quickly. They do have nuclear weapons as well. Brazil, unfortunately, remains a pseudo-fascist dictatorship, supporting like-minded regimes around South America. They've even gone so far as to declare the Pope in Rome an anti-pope, and founded their own branch of highly traditionalist, fundamentalist Catholicism, which has taken South America and Africa by storm. On the other side of the Second Cold War, the European Federation shambles along. Their power and prestige peaked in the 2030s, but now they are in decline. The European Federation has become a corrupt, bureaucratic de facto dictatorship, its political parties merely being factions for a United Europe coalition that rules from Brussels. Cut off from much of Asia, the EF had turned its back on high-tech long ago, using oceans of cheap labor from the Middle East and Africa. These laborers have been effectively walled off in ghettos, where they're separated from the main population for their own safety. However, there are reformers in Brussels who want to slowly bring Europe back to the glory it once had. Canada and Mexico, heavily damaged by radiation, do remain somewhat similar to their old 2016 selves. Canada, while rejecting the monarchy after several diplomatic rows with the UK during the breakdown of NATO, remains a democracy, albeit one that's voted for the Liberals time and again for the past 40 years. All opposition parties are token parties, and the Liberals are facing their own problems with corruption. Mexico had periods of military dictatorship, but is doing better with democratic reforms, and is even cooperating with the SAR in patrolling the Great Wall of America. In fact, Mexico is considering dropping out of its alliance commitments with Canada, as the largely religious, conservative Mexican population is largely finding itself more in agreement with the SAR than the DRNA. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is more or less the same government-wise. While oil is not as important as it once was, the Saudis have a lot of nuclear power, including weapons. None of these states particularly like the DRNA, which they see increasingly as a batshit insane liability. The Anglosphere Alliance began as the neutral UK's way of restoring its influence without siding with either Brussels or Moscow in the post-Second American Civil War world order. Starting first with economic alliances with former colonies and Anglosphere states, the Anglosphere Alliance eventually evolved into a genuine alliance. They even included Japan, which saw a second renaissance in the 2030s and didn't want to be in Moscow or Beijing's orbit. The Anglosphere enjoys the highest standards of living on Earth, with even their parts of Africa doing well. India surpassed China a decade ago, and may even dethrone the UK as the leader of the alliance. Points of interest. Alaska was quickly occupied by Russia, although it was briefly invaded by Canada. The Canadians were thrown out rather handily, and Alaska became a means of supplying SAR troops during the war, and a place for Russian bombers to fly sorties out over the continental United States. Resistance has finally been crushed in the West, and work camps have been set up in their place. People have been born in these camps, and they too are re-educated. The DMZ is most tense in the Rust Belt, which only narrowly went for Hillary. Fighting was ferocious, with many of the cities being bombed to rubble even before the atomics were used. The area remains somewhat depopulated on both sides of the DMZ, with only military personnel really remaining. Both sides use massive speakers and holograms to blast propaganda at the other side. Hawaii was neutral for a while, but then declared for the federal government. Neither the Russians nor Chinese could really challenge the US Pacific Fleet, which became instrumental to securing the West Coast from the SAR and Russian troops pushing federal forces into the sea. Now, Hawaii is one massive militarized zone, the site of the DRNA's space program, and rumored to be the site of a considerable portion of its submarine fleet. The locals all work in the military industry or in the tourist industry, taking care of top DNC officials on vacation. Cuba is a neutral state, and incidentally the last communist state on Earth. However, they reject globalism and American progressivism, and they now have very little in common with Eurasia. Havana has once again become a city of vice for the entire continent, and it is also a city full of spies. It is also a common meeting place for both sides of the Second American Civil War. The EF has control of the Panama Canal, and with it, practical control of the Atlantic. The SAR's Atlantic Fleet is little more than a Caribbean police force and coast guard, limited by arms treaties. In case of war, the Eurasians would have to go through the Strait of Magellan to get their Pacific assets into the Atlantic, and vice versa. Norway went nationalist in the mid-2020s, leaving the European Defense Treaty Organization and then building a wall along their border with Sweden. Norway is an important asset in Eurasia's strategy, as they provide safe coasts and harbors for the Eurasian North Sea Fleet to enter the Atlantic. Eastern Europe is still filled with opposition to the EF, despite such parties and sentiments being banned for being intolerant and divisive. Serbia is the poorest state in Europe, no thanks in part to it being completely cut off from outside trade, apart from the occasional Eurasian shipment of aid, and that the government spent a quarter of its GDP on defenses in the last 5 decades. The Ukrainian National Army continues to bomb targets in Kiev, kill cops, and even assassinated the mayor of Sevastopol back in 2042. The Second Georgian War of 2036 through 2038 finalized the breakaway of South Ossetia and Abkhazia, and made them member states of the Eurasian Federation. Georgia joined the European Federation later. Kurdistan is the newest member of the European Federation, and the only member to be entirely in Asia. Some Eurasians point out that this technically makes the European Union a Eurasian Federation, but they did it before it was cool. The Syrian Arab Republic is a genuine democracy, and has been for decades. It's one of the tech centers of the Middle East, competing with Israel. Iraq remains divided between the Northern Kingdom of Iraq, a Sunni state with a monarchy related to the House of Saud, and the Republic of Iraq, a Shia state that still maintains theocratic elements left over from earlier in its existence. Egypt is a rather secular democratic republic, and one that has really toned down the anti-Semitism. It is the richest country in North Africa, and the second most powerful GDU state in the Middle East region. Sudan, on the other hand, is a rather nasty Islamist supremacist state. The Iranians are rather embarrassed by their antics, but they are a good counter to Egypt. Nigeria and Ghana are two of the powerhouses of Africa, and were added to the Anglosphere early on in its expansion throughout Africa. The Third Congo War of 2027 through 2031 was the bloodiest war in Africa, and the first of many proxy wars between the nationalists and the South Africans. Somaliland was stable for much of the early 21st century, and is now a powerhouse in East Africa. It is also the location of several British bases to counter the Chinese base in Djibouti. Afghanistan was divided during the Afghan Civil War of 2026 through 2033 between the Iranian-backed secular South and the Islamic Emirate in the north. The Democratic People's Republic of Korea collapsed shortly after the fall of the CCP, as the Second Republic did not want anything to do with the DPRK and allowed the regime to starve to death. Afterwards, the Chinese swept in as liberators, and the Koreans are some of the most adamant devotees of the Chinese regime. The radical Magalia movement took control around the same time as the Second American Civil War. The regime models itself after the DRNA, and now people are trying to retreat north across the DMZ. The Republic of Vietnam is rather conservative and anti-communist. This has been a Persephone Foundation timeline reading. Thank you for listening.